Chapter 37. A not-so-quiet start. He's arrogant, and a show-off Minerva. Severus spat. And all three of them should be expelled for using underage magic. The minister himself let them off with a warning. Severus, so who are you to say anything about it? She spat back. Or are you just upset over Mr. Potter's comments about you-know-who? She asked with a haughty smirk. Severus glared at her over the table and threw down the edition of the Daily Prophet, with Skeeter's article, he had been holding in his hands. Flitwick, Poppy, Remus, and Sprout were firmly on Minerva's side, and they glared at the potions master, who sat down with a scoff. It was the day before school started, and Albus had called for everyone to attend the usual preterm staff meeting that was held every year. Albus had brought to everyone's attention the article written by Rita Skeeter 3 weeks before, and said he wanted to get everyone's opinion on the matter. Which, of course, was why Minerva and Severus were yelling at each other. Albus and the other professors sat back watching the confrontation, but Albus had been quiet during the argument. He had already expressed his opinion on the matter, and had agreed with both of them. He agreed that Harry was an arrogant show-off, but didn't agree with expelling him. Contrary to your belief, Minerva, Potter and his friends aren't the perfect little angels you make them out to be. I know they aren't angels, Severus, but the point is that the minister let them off with a warning. They shouldn't be expelled for defending his life. Actually, Remus broke in, Harry never fired a spell that day. I was there. It was Mr. Ruffin who stunned Crouch. Not Harry. Skeeter's article sort of embellished what took place that day. Of course you jumped to the Golden Boy's defense, Lupin. Severus said, rolling his eyes. Well, I personally think the matter should be dropped. Flitwick said with a nod. It was nearly 3 weeks ago, and we have more important matters to discuss. Rightly said, Phileas. Sprout said, as she continued to glare across the table. I also agree. Albus said with a nod, as he leaned forward in his chair. The Triwizard Tournament will kick off on October 30th with the arrival of Spittons and Durmstrang, and the champions will be selected the following night, which of course, is Halloween. I want Hogwarts to make a good impression on our guests, so Mr. Filch, I want the castle to sparkle. Clean everything. The portraits, corridors, walls, everything. I also want us to put aside our in-house bickering for the year. He added, glancing pointedly at Minerva and Severus, but then he continued. While Spittons and Durmstrang will be housing and teaching their own students, they will be taking meals in the Great Hall, and they are more than welcome to wander around and explore the castle if they wish. Madame Maxime has requested that her students be seated with Ravenclaw, and Headmaster Karkaroff has requested that his students be seated with Slytherin. Any questions? Everyone, except Minerva, shook their heads, but the deputy headmistress adjusted her glasses and eyed Albus sternly. You say you want us to put aside our in-house bickering, Albus, but what about you? Are you going to continue slandering Mr. Potter in front of our guests, or are you going to let them make up their own minds about the boy? There were several loud gasps heard throughout the room, but the head of Gryffindor never wavered as she continued to eye Albus pointedly. Severus, Remus, and Poppy clamped their jaws shut in order to hold back the snorts and giggles they were suppressing. Albus, on the other hand, glared at her. I will not dignify that with a response, Minerva. He nearly growled out, but then he took a deep breath and glanced around the room. Since there are no other questions, I wish to bring to your attention to an extra member of our staff this year. Most of you know him, but for the very few who don't, I ask you all to welcome my good friend, Alastair Moody. From out of one of the dark corners, Moody stepped out and thumped his way over towards the table. His magical blue eye spun rapidly in its socket as it swept the entire room, but zeroed in on Severus as the old retired stood with his back against the nearest wall. Alastair has agreed to stay at Hogwarts this year for the simple purpose of security. Albus went on to say. I know everyone here knows what Igor Karkaroff's former occupation was, and while I do think he has turned from that path, I'm not willing to take any chances. It's no secret that Durmstrang openly teaches the dark arts, and I want each and every one of you to keep a close eye on our Hogwarts students, particularly Harry and his friends. Albus! Remus cried, jumping out of his seat. What are you suggesting? That Harry is going to run off wanting to learn how to curse mugs with Karkaroff? Not at all, Remus, Albus said calmly, but I don't want Harry getting any ideas about learning the dark arts. He already knows too much about them as it is. I seriously doubt that there is anything Potter can learn from Karkaroff, Severus drawled. The double meaning of Severus's statement caused Minerva to outright snort, but she covered it quickly by glaring at him. I seriously doubt that there is anything Mr. Potter wants to learn from Karkaroff. I am pretty sure he already knows all about the Death Eater. She spat. Albus sighed loudly. This is exactly what I'm talking about. We have got to stop the in-house bickering. Alastair is only here as an extra security precaution. Given his feelings about Death Eaters, I seriously doubt that Harry will want anything to do with Igor himself. However, learning the dark arts from the Durmstrang students is another matter altogether. Oh, I get it now, Remus said, laughing loudly. So Mad Eye is here to protect Karkaroff from Harry. Albus glared at him as Minerva and Poppy burst out laughing, but everyone jumped in their seats when Moody also began laughing. Sounds like my kind of lad actually. Especially if he hates all Death Eaters, he said gruffly, eyeing Severus and making the young man shift uncomfortably in his seat. As I recall, he did call their precious Dark Lord a half-blooded son of a mole. I don't think I stopped laughing for 3 full days after I read that in the paper, he said with a twisted grin that did not seem to suit his face at all. What of those remarks, Albus? Flitwick asked curiously. Is what Mr. Potter said true? They are, though I don't know how he found out about them. Fudge came to me asking questions about the diary, though he didn't mention anything about it being a Horcrux, so I don't think Harry said anything about that. He didn't, Remus confirmed. He led everyone in the minister's box to believe that it was just a common diary. However, he told Sirius and I, that he, Mr. Nilrem, and Mr. Flamel had looked into Voldemort's background and discovered that tidbit of information, and of course, he shared it with his friends. Well, regardless, I had to tell Fudge only part of what he wanted to hear, and I also let him believe it was just a common diary. Albus said with a sigh. Sounds like Mr. Potter is a true Slytherin, Minerva said, smirking at Severus who sneered at her. Potter is a dunderhead, he said simply. A bit miffed are you, Snape? Mad Eye growled, causing Severus to bristle slightly. Alastair, Dumbledore said in a warning tone. Getting past this and back to the subject at hand, he continued with a loud sigh. With Barty Sr. in Azkaban, Ludo Bagman has taken the helm of running this tournament. Other than Barty, Ludo is the only other one that knows every aspect about it, so expect to see him around here a lot more. Keep your gold in your pockets. Flitwick chuckled merrily, and others groaned and shook their heads. The staff meeting broke up soon after that, but as they all filed out of the room, Remus, Minerva, Poppy, and Severus glanced nervously at one another. They all knew that with Mad Eye being around this year, they would have to be extra careful in avoiding him. And that blasted eye of his. And Pigeon is just jealous that I did something wonderful, and she didn't, Nora said, slithering around on the seat in the train compartment. It was me, not her, who caught the man, and I am proud of me. Although I really didn't relish being stuck on that railing because it was very high off the ground. I don't have wings like that haughty feather duster. Salazar chuckled and looked around at the children. This is what I have had to put up with for the last 3 weeks. And you will continue to put up with it until I'm done praising myself, Nora answered, as everyone burst out laughing. Where is Hedwig, by the way? Hermione asked, trying to hide a giggle. She decided that she wanted to fly on ahead this year. Salazar answered, pointedly glancing at Nora, who was happily investigating the box of Bertie Bott's Neville was holding. They were already halfway to Hogwarts, and Salazar and Godric had sat all the children down to warn them about Moody and stressed that they needed to be extra careful about what they said and did this year. Fred and George had left to go find their friends after that, but the twins mentioned that they were also familiar with Moody, and said that the man was very paranoid and he always yelled constant vigilance to anyone within earshot. As soon as the staff meeting let out yesterday, Severus had operated straight to Salazar's flat to warn him about the retired. Salazar was somewhat familiar with Moody because of the First War, but because of losing his memories and being sent to the Dursleys, he didn't know what Moody had been up to since then. So, Severus told Salazar all about Moody, and how he had put most of the Death Eaters in Azkaban. Knowing that the Extra was as paranoid as he was, Salazar warned the children to stay out of the man's way. He didn't want anything to happen to them if Moody got suspicious. "Do you think Moody would side with us?" Blaise asked suddenly, shaking Salazar out of his thoughts. He sighed and shook his head. "Likely not. Moody and Albus are really good friends, so there is a pretty good chance that Albus has told Moody what he thinks about me. No doubt I will be closely watched by both men this year. All we need to do is get through this year without drawing attention to ourselves. Remember, Moody's magical eye can see through practically anything, so be extra careful of your surroundings, and keep any pranks you plan to play in your rooms, or the room of requirement," he said, but then he cocked his head to the side. "Actually, I should tell Fred and George that too. What about Moody seeing through magical disguises? Does that mean you and I are in danger of being discovered?" Godric asked as Salazar stood to exit the compartment. "I admit, I don't know much about the man other than what I've been told." He paused with his hand on the door, and looked back at his best friend. "I don't think so, but Severus did say that he can see through the disillusionment charm and invisibility cloaks. The stones are physically transforming stones, so I think we will be all right." "That's a relief," Neville said with a sigh. "Indeed," Godric said with a nod. "Let's just make this year a quiet one like last year and we should be fine." "I agree," Salazar said, stepping out the compartment. He left Godric with the children and headed down the train until he found Fred and George, and they assured him that they would hide everything in the room of requirement. However, on the way back to his compart he found his way blocked by a blonde with two bookends. "Where do you think you're going, Potter?" Draco snarled. "Back to my compartment," Salazar answered, trying to sidestep them, but Crabbe and Goyle blocked his way. "You think you're so special, Potter, but those things you said about the Dark Lord are nothing but lies," he hissed. "And you will pay for what you have said, Potter. You will see." "I seriously doubt that there is anything you can do to me, Draco," Salazar said with a slight chuckle. "There are a lot of people who are very angry for you saying what you did," Draco replied with a dangerous glint in his eye. "Be careful, or you will wind up dead." Salazar chuckled with amusement and playfully ruffled Draco's hair. "You're absolutely hysterical, Draco. I'll keep that in mind, so you can run along and play now." "You'll die this year, Potter. Mark my words," Draco said through gritted teeth, before stalking away. Salazar just rolled his eyes and made his way back to the compartment, but he did wonder about the threat, and decided to keep his eyes open. The rest of the journey passed with no incident, and when they arrived at the castle, it was storming. They met up with Colin and Luna, who had been sitting with other friends of Colin's for the trip, and shielded their heads and against the driving rain as they quickly found an empty carriage and settled in. "I really feel sorry for Dennis," Colin chuckled, shaking the rain out of his cloak. "I feel sorry for all of the first years," Godric laughed. "Your brother is so excited to be here, Colin," Luna said, watching in fascination as the raindrops ran down the carriage window. Yeah, he is, but we had a sneaky suspicion that he was magical a year ago when he stopped the Christmas ham from falling when Dad almost dropped it on the floor. Colin laughed. They all thought it was me at first, but nope, it was Dennis. He said with a large grin. Well, I'm happy for your family, Salazar said with a chuckle. 2 magically gifted children from the same mole family is really rare. How does that happen, by the way? Hermione asked curiously, as the carriages came to a stop in front of the castle's doors. Well, honestly, I think it's because of 2 reasons. First, I believe it's magic's way of protecting itself, Salazar answered as they stepped out of the carriage. As the purer bloods continue to intermarry, magic comes up with a way to keep itself pure and fresh. It's no secret what happens when family continues to marry family, and mole genetics proves that. It also because of squibs. It's well known mole-borns come from squibs who have married moles, though it takes several generations for the magical gene to resurface. That is the biggest load of dragon dung I've ever heard, Potter, Pansy Parkinson said with a scowl as they all made their way inside. Everyone knows that bloods are far more superior compared to filthy mole-borns. As evidenced by Crabbe and Goyle. Hermione shot back, just as Crabbe tripped over his own feet and fell face first in the mud. Pansy glared at her, but brushed past them and headed into the Great Hall. They all shook their heads and giggled as Crabbe picked himself up and looked around in confusion, but they split up and headed for their respective tables. The sorting commenced, and just as he did every year, the sorting hat began to sing. Hat's song told everyone about the founders and how they came to choose their students, but something the hat sung caught the attention of more than a few people who stared in a chuckling Godric's direction. Hat ousted you, Salazar whispered with a grin. Now they know he belonged to you. I'll never hear the end of Hermione's questions. Godric chuckled. Particularly the ones about how we all cast the spell to make him come alive. From the look on Fred and George's face, something tells me that we are going to have a bunch of singing hats to deal with this year, Salazar said with a slight groan. Blaise burst out laughing. That sounds like an excellent prank. Indeed. Godric grinned, as Salazar shook his head and chuckled. As the sorting ended and the feast began, the usual chatter and sounds of eating filled the Great Hall. They hadn't been eating long when the Great Hall's doors flew open and Peeves zoomed in cackling madly. Everyone stopped eating and looked up in horror, wondering what the poltergeist was up to. Peeves. Baron and nearly headless Nick roared together, as they glared at the menace. We told you no. Nick finished. Well, I don't need your permission, your headlessness. Peeves snapped, as he glared at Nick. I'm not here to talk to you. Peeves, what is it that you want? Baron asked angrily. You've already asked to attend the feast, but we already told you no because you can't behave. Well, I'm here to ask for permission from someone else, he said in a silky voice as he grinned. Peeves, Albus said as he stood up. You may attend if you behave. I'm not asking for your permission, headmaster, Peeves said with a glint in his eye that suddenly made Salazar's stomach knot up. I'm here to ask Lord Slytherinus and Lord Gryffie for their permission. Godric groaned slightly and shook his head as Peeves glided over to them and stopped just above their heads. Lord Gryffie, Lord Slytherinus, may I have your permission to attend the feast? I promised to behave and not throw food, he asked in a false innocent tone that instantly caused Salazar to raise an eyebrow at him. Mr. Potter, Mr. Ruffin, you may not know the details of Peeves's earlier antics when he scared the house elves out of their wits in the kitchen. Baron yelled. All because we told him he couldn't attend. No one asked you, Peeves shouted. All I want is to be included. I feel so left out of the goings-on in the castle. Salazar didn't believe that for a second, and he cleared his throat to speak, but Godric cut in. And why should we let you, Peeves, when we know that you will likely throw food? I won't, Lord Gryffie. I promise, Peeves exclaimed. If I do anything unsavory during the feast, I will stand still and let you banish me forever," he said with a wide grin. "I say we give him a chance," the fat friar said, floating over towards them. "It couldn't hurt," Gordrick said, looking at Salazar and shrugging. Peeves grinned at Gordrick, but Salazar stood there with a smirk on his face. "And what about after the feast, Peeves? You said during the feast, but what have you got planned for after it?" "You can't pull the wool over my eyes," Salazar said, eyeing Peeves carefully. Peeves's grin widened. "Lord Slytherinus is just too smart to make a deal with old Peevesy," he exclaimed. Peeves began cackling loudly, and all of a sudden, he began lobbing water balloons in every direction. The students shrieked and ducked, but Peeves zoomed out of the great hall at top speed. Salazar glared at the retreating poltergeist, and sat back down with a huff. "We should have gotten rid of him a century ago," Gordrick grumbled, as he picked a busted water balloon out of his mashed potatoes. "I agree," Salazar said with a sigh. Then he glanced up at the head table. Albus was frowning at him, and a man with a big blue false eye was studying him carefully. Salazar knew that it was Moody, and it made him uncomfortable with the way Moody was looking at him. The rest of the feast went by without incident, but when Albus stood up to make his usual start-of-term announcements, Salazar and Gordrick grinned at each other. Albus told everyone that Quidditch was cancelled for the year in favor of the True Wizard tournament being held at the school. This caused an excited murmur to spread through the Great Hall, until Albus told them the restriction. No underage wizards were allowed to enter. This caused an uproar in the Great Hall that took Albus several minutes to squelch. He explained the dangers of the tournament, and said that they would be taking precautions to make sure no underage wizards could enter, which only caused more grumbling. He then went on to explain that they would be hosting Buxbatons and Durmstrang, and asked everyone to be on their best behavior this year. During this time, he also introduced Moody. Several Slytherins eyed the man with a bit of fear, but most just stared at his face, which was stony as he surveyed the student body. When Albus finished his announcements, he dismissed them to their common rooms, and everyone filed out of the Great Hall whispering excitedly about the True Wizard tournament. "You have to hurry, you just have to," Fred pleaded. "Please, Gordy," George begged. "We will do anything." "No," Gordrick said, shaking his head. "Because I'm sure your mother would find a way to kill us if we did." It was the next morning at breakfast, and the twins were nearly on their hands and knees in front of the Slytherin table begging Salazar and Gordrick to help them enter the tournament. Minerva was up at the head table chuckling, and Poppy was glaring daggers at them, as if to dare any of them to actually end up in the contest. "But we will be 17 in April," Fred cried as he looked up at the two founders with pleading eyes. "That's before the school year ends. You have to help us." "What are we supposed to do this year? With no Quidditch and us not being able to enter the tournament, we will be bored," George exclaimed. "And that doesn't bode well for the residents of Hogwarts," Fred added ominously. "Oh, I don't know, perhaps you could concentrate on your schoolwork?" Salazar said, making Gordrick chuckle. The twins stared at him in shock, as if it was the most ridiculous thing they had ever heard, but they both sighed loudly and picked themselves up off the floor. "Fine," George said with a still determined grin. "But that doesn't mean we won't try and find a way ourselves," Fred said, loud enough for the whole Great Hall to hear. "We will not give up without a fight." "Here, here," Lee Jordan shouted from the Gryffindor table. "But why are you asking for their help?" "I have an idea." "Excellent, old chap," Fred cried, glaring at Salazar and Gordrick before quickly making their way back over to their own table. Salazar laughed and shook his head. "Think they will succeed?" he asked. "I don't know, it is Fred and George," Blaze chuckled. "Personally though, I'm not interested. People can get killed in this tournament." "Yes, they can," Salazar said seriously, but he looked up as Severus approached. "Potter, If your worshippers are done making a scene, I wish to ask for your permission to pass out the schedules," he said with a sneer. Blaze choked down a snort, but Salazar stood up and mockingly bowed. "You may proceed, Professor," he said, which caught Severus off guard for a moment. He narrowed his eyes, and smirked. "Weasleys. 5 points from Gryffindor for making a scene." Fred and George began protesting loudly, but Salazar just shook his head, and sat back down as Severus scoffed and shoved Salazar's schedule in his face. They all knew Minerva or Remus would correct the points later. "What happened to getting through this year without drawing attention to ourselves?" Godric asked with a chuckle. "Well, Severus and I have to have our yearly spat when he passes out the schedules." Salazar shrugged. "The year wouldn't feel right if we didn't." Blaze snorted just as Neville and Hermione came hurrying over to compare schedules. They ended up having defense together, as well as runes, creatures, and potions, which made everyone happy. Colin and Luna also came over to compare their schedules with Godric, but just as they sat down, a loud bang was heard and several breakfast dishes rattled as someone slammed their hand down on the table. "I have put up with filth sitting at this table for the last 3 years, but I won't anymore," Montague shouted as he stood up. "Leave now," he added, glaring at the 3 Gryffindors and lone Ravenclaw. "Oh, so now that your little buddy Flint has finally graduated, you've taken his place as top Death Eater in training," Salazar said with an amused chuckle. "Congratulations." "They are not going anywhere," Godric added, glaring at the boy. "They have every right to sit here. They are not in Slytherin. Tell them to go back to their own worthless tables," Montague said through gritted teeth. "No," Salazar said, glaring at the idiot. Salazar's simple matter-of-fact tone caused Neville to snort, which seemed to set off the high-strung Montague. The idiot boy jumped up and brandished his wand, but Salazar and the others were instantly on their feet. Hermione, Blaze, and Neville stood in front of Colin and Luna, with Salazar and Godric standing in front of them. Salazar shook his head and sighed, then he looked at Montague. "Do you really want to take on all of us by yourself? I suggest you just reconsider," he said calmly. "He's not alone," Draco shouted, jumping up, along with Grab, Goyle, Knot, and Pansy. "You may think you're better than us, Potter, but you are far from it. You and your filthy, unworthy friends are going to pay for all that you have done and said over the last few years, Potter. We aren't going to put up with you any longer," Pansy shouted. "Is that right?" Salazar asked, as a bit of amusement flickered across his face. "I insist you all stop this at once," Albus shouted from the head table, as he glared at all of them. "Harry, apologize to Mr. Montague and his friends." Salazar stared at Albus in shock. "Why? They are the ones who should apologize." "Do as I said, Harry," Albus said sternly. "Absolutely not," Salazar shouted, suddenly growing very angry. "I will not apologize for protecting my friends from Death Eaters in training. I won't. They were the ones calling Hermione, Colin, Neville, and Luna filthy and unworthy. Harry, you will apologize for instigating the confrontation," Albus shouted. "Instigating the confrontation," Salazar said in disbelief, as his voice trailed off and he stared at Albus, but then Salazar glared at him. "I'm not apologizing to them, headmaster, and as an educator, you should have enough common sense to not let the guilty party get away with their transgressions, while at the same time punishing the innocent. All it does is breed more bad behavior," he shouted. "Don't you shout at me, Harry," Albus exclaimed. "I saw what I saw." "Well, you clearly need to clean your glasses," Salazar spat, causing Godric to snort loudly. 100 points from Slytherin," Albus shouted. "That puts Slytherin at negative points, seeing as the year just started." Salazar clenched his jaws together and glared daggers at Albus. 110 points to Slytherin, for me having common sense," he suddenly shouted. Everyone watched in complete shock as 10 emeralds fell into Slytherin's hourglass. Albus's mouth dropped open, but Salazar continued to glare at him. "Do not trifle with me, headmaster, because you have no idea who you are dealing with." "And just who is he dealing with, Potter?" Moody asked, suddenly standing up and making his way to the side of the head table. Salazar didn't take his eyes off Albus as he answered Moody. "Someone who has disarmed the man twice, stunned him once, and snapped his wand in half. Just get the kind and grandfatherly headmaster to tell you all about the last day of my second year, when he tried to obliviate me," he shouted. "I have the memory as proof if you don't believe me." There were several gasps from not only the students, but the professors as well, and Moody glanced sideways at Albus, as if waiting for an explanation. However, Albus just glared at Salazar. "Harry, I know it wasn't you who did that. It was that Nilram man instead. He must have been here that day." This caused Salazar and Godric to burst out laughing. "That's all you have to say about it?" Godric asked. "You can't even admit that you tried to obliviate a 12-year-old." "I did it for his own good," Albus shouted as he glared at Godric. "For my own good, or the greater good, headmaster? Which was it?" Salazar asked pointedly, as he raised an eyebrow. "Your old pal Grindelwald would certainly be delighted to know that you have resurrected that particular phrase." "Enough!" a red-faced and enraged Albus shouted. "Isn't it time for all of you to head to your first period classes? I suggest you get there." Albus stalked out of the great hall with Moody at his heels, but the other students just sat there staring at Salazar and Godric, until Minerva started shooing everyone out of the great hall. "So much for a quiet year," Godric grumbled, as they headed back to the Slytherin table to gather their things. "What was I supposed to do? Let him walk all over us?" "No, I think not," Salazar replied gruffly. "No, it's not that," Godric replied, as they all made their way to the doors. "I was just talking about in general." Salazar sighed and nodded. "I understand. Let's just try to get through the rest of the day as quietly as we can." Hermione laughed. "Easier said than done, I expect." "Indeed," Salazar said, and rolled his eyes as Draco sneered at them. Albus sighed heavily as he sat down in his desk chair, while Moody stood in a corner and swept the room with his magical eye. Albus called for some lemon tea, and when it had arrived, he stirred it slowly before looking up. "Do you see what I mean about Harry being arrogant and a show-off?" Albus asked, looking over at his friend. "I do, but Albus, I've got to disagree with you on one point. Potter didn't instigate anything," Moody said, eyeing Albus carefully. Albus sighed again and nodded. "I know, Alastair," he said quietly, "but I have been trying to be kind to those Slytherins who are in the most danger of becoming Death Eaters. I'm trying to send a message that I will stand up for them, and are willing to help them." "And what of Potter?" Moody asked. "Harry is a lost cause, I'm afraid. Although, at times I wonder if it's not the Horcrux in his scar that influences the boy. He acts so much like Voldemort did when he was in school." "But you can't vilify Potter if he is innocent, Albus, and I actually have to agree with the lad. Letting the guilty get away with things, and punishing the innocent isn't going to solve anything. It's just going to make the problem worse. I know those kids' families. Malfoy, Nott, Parkinson, Crabbe, Goyle, and Montague spout the same rhetoric that their fathers do. You can't save them all, Albus." "I saved Severus," Albus said sharply. "That's because Snape wanted to be saved. These ones don't, but I still don't even know if I trust Snape." "Well, I do," Albus replied. "All I ask you to do is keep a watch out for Nicholas and Nilrem. They like to walk around here disillusioned and or under invisibility cloaks. I don't trust them, nor do I trust Harry. Also, keep a watch on Karkaroff and the Durmstrang students when they arrive." "I will, Albus, that's why I'm here." Moody said gruffly. But I have got to say, have you ever realized that Nilrem is Merlin spelled backwards? Albus looked up startled, but he tilted his head to the side and thought about it for a moment. So it is, he said, taking another sip of his tea. His parents probably fancied the name and got clever with the spelling. He certainly isn't the first child his parents named after Merlin. Just watch out for him. He's a graduate of Durmstrang and I fully believe he is a dark wizard. Karkaroff may know something of him. I'll keep both my eyes open, Moody said with a nod. I have another thing, Albus. What of the hourglass? How was Potter able to give points to Slytherin? A confunder's charm, I suspect, the headmaster said, leaning back in his chair. He's probably hoodwinked them to accept points from him. A fourth year? Moody exclaimed. Don't underestimate him, Alastair, Albus warned. The boy is capable of doing magic way beyond his age level, though admittedly, I've never been able to figure out how he is able to do the things he can. Moody eyed him carefully, but then sighed. I'll see if I can find out. I'm going to go make my rounds. I'll see you at lunch. Albus nodded and watched Moody stagger out the room, but when his friend was gone, he sighed loudly. No one understands Harry like I do, he thought, scowl. He dangerous. Why can't people just see and accept that? Salazar had been in a bad mood all day, and not just because of what happened with Albus in the Great Hall that morning. All day long he had heard people whispering about him being a liar, and that he hadn't stunned the headmaster. Never mind that Albus practically admitted that it had happened. Sometimes Salazar just didn't understand some wizards, or their lack of critical thinking skills. Godric suggested he use the enchanted ceiling in the Great Hall as a pensieve to show the memory of Albus trying to obliviate him. He insisted it would put an end to those calling him a liar, but Salazar refused. He said it would only cause more problems and make people ask more questions. Besides, he felt it was best to save that trick for a rainy day. To his knowledge though, Salazar didn't think anyone knew about the true nature of the enchanted ceiling. In the old days, Helga would go on trips to study non-native magical plants, then she would come back and turn the ceiling into a pensieve and use it as a teaching tool. She'd point out and explain all the properties of different plants and herbs, and it was also a great way to show the children of those days different parts of the world. Godric and Salazar used it to teach defense against and the dark arts at the same time. They would get into duels in an attempt to show both sides of the galleon, and then later they would bring their memories of the event back to the school. They couldn't hold these duels on school grounds though, because they were much too dangerous and Rowena was afraid someone would get hurt. As Salazar settled into bed that night, he had a sudden pang of regret when he realized that he hadn't visited Helga and Rowena's graves in a while. Ever since Godric had reappeared in his life he had neglected them in favor of his best friend. He knew he needed to change that, so as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he vowed that he would visit them again soon. In an old run-down manor house on the outskirts of Little Hangleton, a man was kneeling on the floor, whimpering in fright, and staring into the eyes of a large deadly predator. "Hurry up, Wormtail. I don't have all night," a cold raspy voice snapped. Why yes master," the man whimpered. "Try to bite him, but don't really do it," the voice said with a hint of amusement. "I want to see him squeal again." "Can I take just a little piece of flesh, master?" "No. He will die, and all our hard work will be for naught." The large greenish snake huffed with annoyance, but snapped at the whimpering rat-like man, and watched with delight as he squealed and jumped backwards quickly. "Wormtail. She will bite me, master." "No she won't. Now hurry up." Peter whimpered again as he eyed Nagini closely, but scurried back towards her. He held up a small file with a shaking hand, and watched in horror as her fangs descended from their resting place. Placing the file just underneath one of her fangs, He carefully collected the small amount of venom she deposited into it, but as soon as he had corked the bottle, she hissed loudly and lunged towards him. Peter screamed loudly, and landed with a soft thump on his back as Voldemort looked on in amusement. "That was a good one, Nagini. You'll have to do that again." "I try to please you, Master," she said in a silky voice as she slithered over towards him. Peter quickly scrambled to his feet and made his way over to the bubbling potion that was sitting in the corner. He placed a small amount of the potion into the phial, mixed the two, and with a terribly shaking hand, placed the phial to the deformed and grotesque lips of his master. After he drank the potion, Voldemort smiled a twisted cruel smile. "Nagini, now you may chase the rat around the room." "With pleasure, Master," she exclaimed. He watched for several minutes as a screaming Peter ran around in circles trying to get away from the large reptile, but Voldemort finally called a halt to the evening's entertainment with a flick of his hand. "Wormtail, I am cold. Place my chair closer to the fire," he commanded, lifting a twisted finger and pointing towards the fireplace. "Of course, Master." The out-of-breath man wheezed, and carefully moved the chair into the desired location. Voldemort stared into the fire and watched the flames flicker and dance. "The boy dares to curse me and my lineage. He will pay for that," he thought as his scowl deepened. "With Crouch being caught and now in Azkaban, I need to figure out a new way in order to get Potter into the Triwizard Tournament. He needs to be kept alive throughout it though. How do I go about doing that?" he mused, still staring into the fire as Nagini gleefully began chasing Wormtail around the room again.
Hello everyone, I am Nat1995 here with a small announcement for the video game fanfic plot. I know in every ending of videos there is a small announcement that I will take requests for any fanfic or video game. That will stop right now. I have too much videos that I need to complete. There's sequels that need to be put up. I am sorry. For any requests that people suggested will be put on the back burner until I completed my videos. I even made a list of videos that needed to be completed. I am so sorry about that. Until next time, I am Nat1995, signing off.